Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. So right now we're in the middle of what's been described as the biggest remote working experiment in history. But how has this experiment affected employees so far? What kind of support do people need, whether it's from software, from their HR departments, their operation departments, their management, etc. And how is this experiment going to affect demand for remote working among employees in the future? These are some of the questions that we're going to be covering in today's session. But before we begin, just to introduce ourselves, my name is Verna, and I'm a Strategic Insights Manager here at Global Web Index, based out of New York. And joining me from London is my colleague Chris, a Senior Analyst specializing in consumer trends.
Hi there, everyone.
And I also wanted to mention that all of the research we'll be discussing today is freely available in the form of a white paper on our Coronavirus Content Hub. You can access this directly from our website and on the link that's posted here. There you'll also be able to find blogs, white papers, and other additional studies that we've done all around the coronavirus outbreak. So I'd really encourage you to have a look.
On the agenda for today, we're going to be looking at how businesses have responded to COVID-19, what kind of lessons we can learn from businesses that have already practiced remote working, and take a closer look at what sort of challenges, benefits, and lessons have been brought on by this large-scale working from home experiment that has been the last few weeks.
But before we dive into all of that great research, we just want to give you all a brief overview into who we are here at Global Web Index, just so that you have a sense of our research, our methodology, and essentially where the data is coming from. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, Global Web Index is a market research company that provides consumer insight to leading brands, marketing agencies, and media organizations worldwide. It's home of the world's largest ongoing survey on the digital consumer and has the largest panel of consumers globally at 22 million people across 46 different markets. This research is representative of around 2 billion internet users. We make this data available through an intuitive subscription-based platform, allowing teams to dive in and cross-analyze their audiences to understand their behaviors, attitudes, interests, and more.
In addition to our main products, we run a lot of dedicated custom research across all different topics and markets. The insights we'll be discussing today were predominantly taken from a custom study we recently ran in the US and UK. We polled just under 4,000 respondents aged between 16 and 64 in both markets. Field work was conducted between April 9th and April 14th. We'll also be drawing on some of our historic syndicated B2B research across 10 markets, and we'll signpost where this is the case. At the beginning of our latest custom research, we asked respondents what their current employment status was. So where relevant, we'll be looking at figures based on those in employment and then on those who've transitioned to remote working.
Well, thank you for that, Chris. So as we mentioned in the agenda, the first section we want to get into today is looking broadly at the professionals' response to the coronavirus crisis. And by that, I mean, what do employees think about how their companies have generally responded? What are they doing? What sorts of long-term effects are working professionals predicting for their companies? And I want to caveat that all of this research will be heavily based on employee perceptions. So not necessarily reflecting exactly what businesses are doing at a high level, but what their workers and their employees are seeing kind of on the ground level. So I'll give you both the bad news and the good news at once here. And that is, it's not all bad, at least when it comes to the actual perceptions of most employees. And of course, it might be a different case when you talk to economists and investors and people who work in the government. But for employees, there is a bit of a balance of both optimism and pessimism, as we would expect. So when asked whether they think that the coronavirus crisis would improve, worsen, or make no difference overall to their company's performance this year, we found kind of a mixed bag among people. 42% of people across the US and UK said they think that this would worsen their company's performance, which is maybe not as high as we would think, as about 28% of people said that they think it actually will potentially improve the company performance, and a further 20% predict it will not have much of an effect.
I think based on things I've read, it seems to be quite optimistic.
Yeah, I would agree. But you do have to look at this across different factors, and then the story starts to kind of come together more. So, for example, people with professional skills or qualifications, like accountants, are driving this average up. They're more likely to say that this will improve the performance of their companies. And, realistically, they might be in a better place for their skills to be in demand during this time. Additionally, and this is something I think is really interesting, is we see this kind of like U curve when it comes to seniority level. So both people at the kind of, I guess, bottom of the management structure and people at the very top of the management structure are likely to be the least optimistic when compared to those that are kind of more in the middle, like professionals or middle management. And it speaks to two interesting things. So general support staff, which kind of more towards the bottom of the management structure, are probably likely worried about their own job security to a high degree. They're going to be the people that are most likely paid less on that kind of hierarchy of management. They might be likely to have less cash reserves and savings, and potentially they're seeing a lot of their peers being laid off or furloughed. So you can understand these very personal concerns that would drive down their optimism. Executive management, though, which is also among like the least optimistic group, have a very different set of concerns. So they're the ones that see the business challenges and the whole business outlook really holistically. And they're making the decisions as to who gets cut, what gets cut, who potentially gets furloughed or doesn't get a promotion. And they're the ones that are really steering the ship during this very difficult time. So both of these two groups have kind of unique added pressures, potentially higher than the groups that are in the middle, for very different reasons, though. And I think we see that this is kind of reflected in the data.
Yeah, and there's some important differences across industries as well. A lot of these are quite intuitive. So people who work in hospitality and tourism, for example, as well as retail, are the least optimistic. And we've all seen how much these industries are suffering right now. People do feel quite defeated. But then there are industries where people feel more positive and even empowered that the current climate has opened up some opportunities. IT and technology is a big one. Of course, all these workplace tools, communication systems, security, VPN networks, so on. There's a huge demand for these now. So you can understand how certain areas in IT feel that they could be thriving.
Yeah, IT is definitely a clear one. And I mean, as you alluded to, we've seen a growth in the number of professional tools and collaboration tools and, security tools within the last few years that has really been quite massive. So it's to be expected that this is an area that might be seeing greater opportunity even among very challenging times.
This next slide is a not so fun one because it looks at what companies are doing in response to the coronavirus crisis, which unfortunately, as we all know, does include things like laying people off and cutting wages. What we found through this data, however, is that those more extreme measures are not among the most common. What most workers in the US and UK are reporting at the moment is that their employers are primarily changing working hours, freezing hiring, starting to furlough staff, and cutting back on production.
Mm. Yeah, the furlough versus layoff thing is very much market-based as well, Chris, as it's so dependent on what governments are doing to stimulate the economy and to assist both businesses and workers. So in the UK, for example, a third of people we surveyed report that they are seeing furloughing going on in their companies, as opposed to a fifth in the US. And inversely, in the US, 15% of people are saying that they're seeing their companies starting to do layoffs, which is only at about 9% for their UK counterparts. And only 6% are recording that their companies are asking people to take pay cuts in the UK, whereas 17% of workers are saying that in the US. So this is really a reflection of the reality of government support. And, I think it just shows it's not as nice of a picture in the US sometimes. But what I want to make sure we caveat here, Chris, is that all of these results are based on employee perceptions. So this is what people report that they're seeing in their companies. But the reality is what businesses are doing might be slightly different. So for example, we know that a lot of businesses are delaying payments to suppliers because that is, one of the easier immediate term solutions to kind of stop a cash flow problem during a difficult time. But that's not necessarily going to be something that they communicate to all of their employees in the business. The same thing with potentially halting promotions or asking certain people in departments to take pay cuts. A lot of these types of measures may not be communicated fully. And so employees may not exactly have the entirely right perception of all of the measures that their employers are taking right now.
Absolutely. I mean, on the furloughing front, as to why there's such a discrepancy, I mean, if anyone listening is not aware, here in the UK, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, announced a scheme towards the end of last month whereby the government would cover up to 80% of a furloughed employee's salary, up to a maximum of £2,500. And it's a kind of state intervention that we've never really seen as a country before. I mean, let alone from our Conservative Party.
Yeah, I mean, drastic times call for drastic measures, right? So as we saw earlier, and as we'll continue to touch on through this session, however, there are certain responses that are more common across different industries. So things like changing hours and cutting back on production are measures that people are typically seeing more frequently in hospitality and manufacturing and the retail services. And whereas actions like delaying payments to suppliers, delaying promotions, and potentially even asking people to take pay cuts are more commonly reported by people who work in financial services, IT, technology, marketing, PR, advertising. So there is some differentiation by industry there. But what I can say is no industry has seen the level of layoffs that hospitality has. And again, this is really an unfortunate reality of this type of crisis. Travel, tourism, food services are suffering a lot. Furlough, however, is one of those that is more or less kind of common enough across different industries. There's not a huge amount of variety. And again, I think this speaks to the fact that government interventions, stimulus packages, these types of factors are really the things that make a big difference as to who sees furloughing happening in their companies more so than others.
Yeah, good points about the industries. Some, as you say, are intuitive and others maybe a bit more surprising. I mean, I found it quite surprising that financial services were the most likely to delay payments to suppliers. But obviously, one of the biggest changes to the workforce right now, while not captured in these types of options around company response, is the transition to remote working. This is going to be the main focus of our session from here on out. The question of how many workers have really transitioned to remote working right now is a tricky one to answer. There's a lot of different numbers out there, and obviously it depends on location. In the US, for example, I know there's different regulations in different states as to who qualifies as an essential worker and so on.
That's right. And the definition is definitely broader than you might expect, I think, in a lot of cases.
Yeah, things like laundromats, liquor stores can be included. Anyway, at this point, a huge number of workers in the US and UK are reporting that they've transitioned to working from home since the coronavirus outbreak began. There's different estimates out there as to what's the true figure, and it's very, very difficult to comment on that. Particular reason for that is because we see considerable variations across industries. So industries like financial services, IT or tech, marketing, advertising, and PR have transitioned to remote working at very high levels, whereas there are certain industries in which this just isn't possible. Healthcare, retail, and hospitality tourism are the ones that stick out. Some people in these industries are considered essential workers, so that's one factor. But then there's the reality that they are industries where physical proximity is necessary to do the job.
That's right. Yeah, that's definitely true. Another difference I think that is important to call out is the variety of working from home by company size. So we tend to see higher degrees of people reporting that they've transitioned to working from home in mid-sized companies when compared to both the smallest and the largest of companies when you look at it by actual employee count. And this observation of mid-level companies aligns with some of what we've seen in our work data set over time, is that there's this kind of sweet spot in company size that balances both flexibility and resources. So very small companies often have a lot of flexibility, right? Because they're more likely to have a relatively flat organizational structure. People have direct access to their management. There's an agility that's able to be achieved, and there's sometimes an implicit understanding that people need to be outside of the workplace to do their best work sometimes, and you can have those freedoms in smaller companies. However, increased hierarchy, layers of management, processes, rules, etc., in very large companies means that a lot of this flexibility is sometimes lost, and people might not be equipped to do things like work from home just because there are more stringent policies about being in the office that comes with a larger company. However, what very large organizations are lacking sometimes in flexibility, they make up for in resources. So it's great to have a flexible work environment in your startup, for example, but if there's not enough money to make sure that everyone has the software they need, the equipment they need, and the support they need to adequately work remotely, that doesn't really help either. So that's where we see the sweet spot of mid-sized companies come into play. There's still enough agility, but there's also better resourcing and better support.
That's a great point, and one I think sometimes we don't always think about. It's that sweet spot between flexibility and resources. It's certainly an important consideration for B2B brands that are looking to target professionals right now. And maybe the best place to start is with mid-sized companies where we know people are getting the right mix of agility in terms of that willingness to try new tools and services and maybe a shorter decision-making period, as well as the resources to pay for them.
That's a great application of the insight. Thank you, Chris.
So, as we've intimated so far, remote working has become an overnight necessity for many businesses worldwide. And this was something that was fairly widespread before the crisis, but we're in a situation now where many companies that have never meaningfully tackled it have had to adopt it or at least rapidly scale it up. For example, our company had probably fairly generous and flexible remote working setup before the crisis, but like many in the UK and other countries, it tended to be something that was reserved more of a once a week style perk if you worked here for a certain period of time or at a certain level of management, or for one-off occasions where an employee's got to be at home, like for a medical appointment, for example. Now, of course, every single one of our colleagues is working from home, and I assume most people listening in today will be in the same situation. Now, we conducted research into the work environment in Q1 of 2019, which is before anyone had contracted or even heard of coronavirus, as part of our ongoing research into business environments. But we do think that the businesses and employees who were working remotely at that time offer very valuable lessons and insights about remote working as a practice that can be applied now. So some numbers. Before the crisis, around a quarter of employees said their companies had broad permit to work remotely, whether from home or another out-of-office location. Half had some license to do it, and another quarter had no permit to do it whatsoever. Of the 10 countries in our research, India and the UK were most generous when it came to working from home, while Japan and France were strictest about having workers in the office or on site all the time.
Yeah, and obviously a country's economy dictates this to a certain degree. So Japan has a notorious working culture and a large manufacturing industry as well that requires employees to be on site. So as you might expect, workers in tech and communication who are closest to the necessary tools were most likely to be working remotely. There's a bit of insight kind of by industry. Further down, you have things where there has to be just more in-person interaction, like retail and manufacturing. But the industries with the least remote working provision were actually healthcare and government. And healthcare, I think, is understandable. But the example of government shows you how certain industries have actually just lagged in adopting remote working, even if there's not really any big need for workers to be in the same place as much as in other industries. With government-linked businesses, there's always been this big concern about secure networks, of course, but it also shows that gatekeeping by decision makers is just as much of a factor sometimes as structural reasons.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be one of the lasting effects of all this. That there's going to be a feeling of, well, if we did remote working then and it seemed to work, why can't we carry on?
Yeah. I mean, this is a good point. And I think sometimes we want to think about some of the myths around remote working. And many of those aren't true, right? We hear sometimes ideas get floated around that people aren't allowed to work remotely as much as they'd like because there's a sense that maybe they're not working as hard as they normally would or putting in the same level of hours, but those really aren't quite true. So quite simply, remote working is a huge boon to employees. And based on what they tell us, it's a big positive factor in their lives. They tend to be more productive, more efficient, more collaborative, and happier in their work. Another interesting thing is that when asked about business challenges, those businesses with broader license to work remotely think that finding and hiring staff is actually less of a problem. Now, there are some downsides or rather challenges to be aware of, and particularly when remote working has scaled up so rapidly as is in our current environment, and we will come to that later. But really, we have to stress that this is something that makes a big positive difference with people and their working lives.
That's right. I mean, in this slide, we can see where the biggest differences are between people who work in businesses that practice remote working and those that don't. So the top two here are massive, I think, in light of the current situation. So the biggest advantage remote workers having their workers feeling like their company is robust enough to tackle industry changes, and also a sense of personal autonomy to pursue new opportunities. And I want to dwell on this for a moment because I think it's a really important point. What we're seeing here is that companies where remote working is broadly committed gain a culture of autonomy and independent problem solving. We often think about remote working for its immediate advantages, saving money on office rents maybe, or working so you're independent of distractions. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think remote working equips companies with a more nimble mentality, which in turn comes from employees with a more independent and proactive mindset. I mean, this is something that Slack, the company behind the collaboration software, talks about quite a lot, about how remote working is just one part of an overall shift to a more dynamic and agile working culture. And what we found through this past research is that companies that commit to it see these virtuous effects happening more broadly.
Yeah, it's striking how we see this kind of competitive advantage comes out. Now, you might think that because virtually everyone is now working remotely, that's lost a little bit. But I think that it just demonstrates how important getting the remote working setup right is, because the companies that do won't just be able to communicate better, they may well be better equipped to handle the coronavirus disruption in general. And obviously, this is a real vindication of extending remote working policies in the long run.
I think if there's one drawback that we can identify from the data on this slide, it's in alignment with company goals and values. And those working from home can sometimes feel detached from what their business is about. I think that shows a couple of things. I mean, in a remote working environment, we know there has to be an extra level of communication, but it's not just about company performance and how the company is doing, but also in reiterating values and having a step up in one-to-one contact in a line management setting so that people understand where they relate to in an organization, both on a results and a value basis. I think that's a necessary price to pay to make remote working function as well as it can.
Yeah, I would agree. And we have some more data here, I think, that really shows what an overall boon remote working can be to employees. And we really want to emphasize that. So in all of the categories that we track, employees are more likely to rate their company as good or excellent, even when it doesn't relate to like their working conditions specifically, when they work for companies where remote working is permitted. So the benefits of remote working go much further than what you might expect. And you can't really argue when you see this kind of increase in employee morale that you see where remote working is permitted, especially. Another interesting finding, I think, is that communication is actually rated higher in businesses that had broad license to work remotely.
I mean, obviously, one thing we've got to be aware of here is that in the current circumstances, where there's been such a big change over such a short period of time, most organizations haven't had the luxury of time to crack their new setup or to experiment with it. And we're sort of just figuring out as we go along. So some of what we see on screen is going to be contingent on making the right business decisions, but we're going to come to that a little bit later.
Mm-hmm. And one place where we can see a slight potential downside actually to remote working is in working extra hours. So we found that remote workers are actually more likely to work late, to work overtime, and to check messages outside of working hours. Now, as we saw before, this doesn't, seem to have a bearing on employee sentiment, as they're still more likely to rate their company highly. But burnout and fatigue look more likely in a remote working setup. And so that really has to be put to mind and actively prevented on the business side.
That's right. And I think this is something that ends up lost when you don't have the physical structure of an office. And there's an onus on businesses to try and nip this in the bud. There's not really that ceremonial aspect to leaving work when you're at home. You're not really clocking off. You're just moving from one room to another, if that.
So these are what businesses with widespread home working can look like. But as we've mentioned, the scale and the speed at which it's been adopted now have totally changed the equation. And through this recent customer research that we've done, we can see how smooth, or not in some cases, the transition has been for workers both in the US and in the UK. So what a lot of people in the industry have been asking about are, understandably, the challenges of remote working. And we've all been thrust into this situation where nearly everyone is working from home for an extended period of time. And companies were not prepared for this. It's a whole new reality, and we're navigating this and having to contend with this reality. And of course, there are going to be struggles. But before the struggles, a key question to look at is, who was prepared for the work from home reality to begin with? And the answer is not a whole lot of companies, or not everyone. We asked people who are now actively working from home whether their companies had any sort of policy in place before this whole thing began. And in the US, 56% of now remote workers said that their companies were essentially in the kind of best case scenario. They had some sort of policy about working from home and had received a basic level of training. In the UK, this is considerably lower, only at about 40%. We see about 1/3 of people saying that their companies had neither a policy nor any sort of training given. And so a lot of companies are just kind of freestyling right now, which is impressive. But what's less common is this kind of middle ground where companies have a policy but haven't really communicated or trained much. I think it's generally a good sign. I think it shows that typically companies are either going all the way by establishing a policy, giving people some sort of support to go along with it, or they haven't even thought about it at all. And this middle ground where, there's some sort of policy communicated, but not training or anything, can be really quite messy, as we're seeing when it comes to cross-analyzing some of these results.
It really can. For example, some of these COVID response measures that show a company is struggling, like closing facilities, delaying payments, and making layoffs, they're more common in companies where people report they may have had a work from home policy but no training, rather than one extreme or the other. So it does speak to an issue of potentially being a bit unprepared on bigger things.
Exactly. And what we also thought was important to call out was how perhaps uninformed maybe some executive management might actually be in regards to policies and trainings for these kind of day-to-day operational things. So those in executive management positions are the most likely to say that their companies have neither a policy nor provided any training. But it's considerably higher than what everybody else is saying. So the question is, does this reflect reality, or does this potentially reflect that management maybe is less in tune with the day-to-day kind of operational policies and processes versus the people whose kind of everyday work is really reliant on this and who are communicating actively with their teams about this all the time?
It's something to ponder on, definitely. It's like you say, it makes you wonder how much preparation is really improvised and happening maybe on a team by team basis, maybe a case of managers taking things into their own hands.
Hmm, that's a good point. So we know that the most dramatic transitions to working from home have come from sectors like IT, finance, and marketing, where virtually everyone has kind of made the shift to remote working at this stage. And this isn't a big surprise. Based on previous research we've done, these are the sectors with the most experience of remote working already. So if you're looking to target a sector as a potential new customers, the ones further down the list would really be the ones that are kind of immediate opportunities for targeting, because they are slightly less prepared, even though so many people have already kind of made the shift to remote working, than these more experienced industries.
That's right. I mean, for me, education really sticks out here. So that's an industry where around 7 in 10 are now working remotely, but of those, fewer than half have had training or preparation, and 35% think that they're just not equipped to handle it.
Hmm. Yeah, I find it interesting that in retail and hospitality as well, much fewer people are working remotely, but they've had more preparation to work remotely than those working in education, at least. And education isn't exactly short on software, but this shows that there's still a lot to do to get staff working effectively from home in this industry. Okay, so shifting slightly from that topic, we're going to look at what the specific logistical challenges are when working from home. And what we're finding is that distraction and security issues are top of mind. So for most people, having to take calls and meetings with other people around is the biggest gripe. Number one, therefore, is all about life circumstances. The second issue, however, is around security. And then we start to see things like slowness or inadequacy of their internet connection become a problem for number three. And the internet one, I think that that is super important, because depending on where you live, how many people are using your network, it can be very, very difficult to have a reliable connection. And this has been called essentially like one big stress test of the entire broadband infrastructure, which in most places wasn't really built to withstand this kind of consistent large long-term usage. And it's hard to do your best work, I think, when obviously you can't get things to load or the communication is going to lag, etc. It's a big concern.
I mean, that's right. I mean, it's almost ironic in a way, because all of the demand for broadband has moved from city centres, which are built to sustain it, into the suburbs, which haven't been really as much.
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of movement has really changed the strain on the infrastructure. One other thing we wanted to look at was around companies with more policy and training versus those without it. So we're seeing that in companies where people report having a policy and training in place, there certainly is a leg up on all of these types of things. So people report many more like severe IT issues when their companies are generally less prepared, which is what you would expect. And what I think is important, however, is to note that nothing can really prepare you for the lifestyle impact. So in companies that have provided people with policies and training around working from home, there's actually even more people who are complaining about the distractions from their living surroundings, like their partners, their roommates, maybe their children. There's really no way to prepare or control for this.
That is really important, Werner. Sometimes people can be quite hard on themselves for not achieving what they perceive to be the same levels of productivity or efficiency at this time than they normally would. And you've got to look at it with that level of understanding. I mean, just because we have the tools and the VPN and the fastest broadband, we can't change our living situations in the same way. I mean, they weren't meant to be optimized for work, they're meant to be optimized for life. And it's important to try and keep some division between those two things now. As you say, it's incredibly difficult to prepare for those circumstances or other people being around you. But it does show how some sort of policy or guidance around these things is just as, if not more important, than finding the right productivity tools, should we say.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I think it can feel impossible sometimes to mitigate for those circumstances. And this next slide really just further validates this observation. So as much as we try, one of the biggest challenges, it seems, is that home creeps into our work and work creeps into our home. Almost 40% of people working from home now in the US and UK say that separating their work life from home life is a working challenge for them. After the issue of distractions, it's the #2 biggest working challenge, bigger than communication issues. Interestingly, collaboration, brainstorming, managing employees, these are all pretty low down the list. And I think traditionally people often have thought that working from home would be less productive, as we talked about earlier. You know, maybe people are slacking off, they're not working their full 8 hours. But all of this data really tells us that the reality is the opposite. People work more. They're not struggling to manage their employees' performance. They're struggling to separate their work life from their home life.
Yeah, it does seem to be something that we're seeing time and time again. I mean, we spoke earlier how in our historic research into the work environment, in situations where employers permit remote working on a normal basis, not related to the COVID crisis, people end up checking their email more outside of hours, working outside of hours, working late, and so on. Here in the UK, the Chartered Institute of Professional Development has good case studies on businesses that have really gone for remote working in the past. And it offers some food for thought about how to manage this, especially based on the research that we've just done. And what really stuck with me was the importance of senior executives going out of their way to communicate how they will be managing their time. It's not just about getting buy-in from senior management on working from home, but making sure that they're champions of it within the organization. And, you know, we're all discovering these hacks and tactics as we go along too. But I think even things like promoting discussion of TV shows and cooking, or setting up extracurricular activities and groups, at least helps promote a healthy culture of separated work and home life.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly relate to that point about work life and home life blending and how important it is when your kind of senior management leads by example in that way. Because I think we are all a bit too connected as well, kind of even before coronavirus. And it's important to stay connected, but people, I think, are now recognizing more and more the importance of also shutting off. So, you know, when is it appropriate to Slack people about work matters? What time do we kind of deactivate, shall we say, informally, the kind of emails that you can send to people? They're all like important things about maintaining that kind of work-life separation. Something else that we've observed here is that when it comes to a lot of these working challenges, sometimes having no policy is actually better than having this messy in between of a policy, but no real communication or training off the back of it. And that does speak to this whole thing of when can you communicate and how much can you communicate with people, and how does that impact their quality of their working lives and home lives. So for example, people who've had neither policy nor training are more likely to complain about communication and routine issues. But it's the people who have a policy but no training who are the most likely to complain about collaboration, brainstorming, and company alignment. So there's really something to be said. And I think it's highly relevant to anyone on the webinar who's working in HR, and our colleagues in HR who talk to us about this all the time, that the kind of difference proper training really makes, or even just the negative impact of having no training when you have a policy. It just does create a lot of confusion.
So, as we mentioned already, there's been an explosion in use of enterprise tools to support remote working, and many of them are now household names if they weren't before. And many, as we've covered before, are even getting used within people's personal lives, which again points to that very thin line between work and home life. But when we look at what workers most want their employees to provide support them, the biggest wish isn't software, it's for better home office equipment. I mean, this is something I can definitely sympathize with because I'm presenting from my kitchen table right now. We do talk a lot about software and how successful it can be in maintaining contacts and common access to data, for example. But there's also a lot to be said about the fundamentals of desk setup, having the right IT equipment, and so on. And we've seen big spikes in purchases of things like webcams, computer monitors. And I mean, I've struggled to buy a desk because they're all sold out at my local retailers. So it is worth emphasizing a lot of people coming at this from a standing start. I mean, many workers, particularly in cities, they're already facing a lot of pressure with their living space to begin with. I mean, the cost of rent versus the amount of space that they can get. And it doesn't always make for the easiest transition to remote working.
Yeah, you're right. It's not the only thing though, because you can start to see that a third of people actually want more flexibility now for their working hours. And I think that this shows us another way of looking at the data that we had a few slides ago about remote workers and working late or working over hours. It doesn't have to be a huge cause for alarm, that remote working is always going to lead to employee burnout, but maybe it can create a space for workers to maybe move away from like the standard 9 to 5 and do what they need to do on a different time scale.
That's true. I mean, some people may be working late because they find they work better in the evening, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true for me sometimes. And and this kind of leads quite well into the whole discussion about mental health. It's a fine line with everything. And as so many people are working in high pressure situations now, one of the last things I want to talk about in this section is mental health. And it's a topic that's getting increased attention now, especially, because it's all a very high intensity, high anxiety situation. I mean, if we step away from all of the data and analysis and just talk about the fact that it is a massive public health crisis, it's a global pandemic of unprecedented proportions with what's expected to be a huge recession to follow. And a lot of us are trying to work just business as usual, which is not easy. And a reality is that our mental health does get neglected at times. So we wanted to get some sort of insight into this through the research. And what we found was that first, younger workers are more likely to be saying that they feel lonely or isolated and that this is a challenge for them in working. Millennials especially, this is true for them. And millennials also want employers to be more committed to mental health. 40% want their employers to check in on them and their colleagues' well-being more often. So, it's a challenge and it's a demand, and loneliness as one of these factors, it's definitely, not equitable across all of the industries. We found that it's a challenge to working from home in a kind of stronger way among people who work in financial services. 24% of those working in this industry reported that they feel lonely or isolated and it's kind of impacting their work. In contrast to those who are in marketing or IT, where it's, much lower. So this could indicate that maybe certain industries are a bit better equipped at taking care of their employees' psychological needs, like, the need for friendship and camaraderie and communication with others that are really important to our work lives as well, and not just kind of the functional needs.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And while remote working offers a chance to support more fluid working hours that might work better for a given employee's needs, it is a very slippery slope to an always-on working culture that is much more negative. And obviously, being physically distant from your colleagues means that a lot of signs that someone is struggling could be easily missed as well.
That's a good point. Cool. So, I mean, as we saw before, companies that have taken the plunge with remote working in the past have generally seen a lot of rewards in employee morale and productivity. And it does have a lot of bonuses worth talking about. So we're going to get into some of these benefits and what kind of learnings we can apply now.
Absolutely. I mean, there are big positives that remote working can bring to people's lives. I mean, we've mentioned a few times already about how remote workers could be more likely to work late or work outside hours. And we're saying this doesn't have to be, completely disastrous. The key is just making sure that there is the flexibility there, so workers get a bit more choice in where exactly they put their hours into the day. I mean, even just the free time from not commuting makes a big difference to people.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, and to be honest, I actually would have thought that having fewer distractions at home would be one of the front runners here. I think that in the past, this has been touted as one of the main perks of working from home is it's a distraction-free environment. But I think now we're in such a unique situation where everything else, not just our job facilities, but schools especially, are closed. So the home environment might not be the kind of haven that it once was, where, it's just you and your computer. And I think, to be honest, that goes back to what we were saying about the right equipment and the right setup. Employers have to step up and recognize how fine that line is between work life and home life right now, and really try to go out of their way to ensure that people are able to work with focus. It's something that right now we just can't take for granted.
I think there's something we can learn here from our previous research into the topic as well, from those businesses that are maybe more practiced with remote working. I mean, as you might imagine, the extent of communication and the volume and the number of tools used increases a lot when working from home, or typically does. So as an employee, you've got to be aware of these new demands on people's time, as they just need to be reading more to understand exactly what's going on.
Yeah, this is true. So now the experiment that almost all of us are kind of currently in, it's made communication within businesses absolutely fundamental, as you were saying. So now more than ever, we're seeing what kinds of tools are more beneficial to productivity. We asked our respondents which tools, whether it's email, collaboration, or conferencing, were the most essential and beneficial to them to just kind of do their best work remotely. And there's a few stories we could pull out here, but I think the most obvious one is the place to start. So the bigger the business, the more important communication tools of any kind are. The bigger organizations aren't just leaning more on email, but they're also leaning more on collaboration tools, on conferencing tools, on kind of anything that enables better communication.
And that's right. And it's understandable why it would be so much more important in large companies. And I want to bring in our previous research here again, where just to give you a rough picture, email really was king. Large enterprises, though, seem to be quite conservative about using these other types of tools, but now it looks like they're leaning on them quite heavily. I mean, before, when we asked workers what they felt the most effective form of communication was, email almost always came out on top, even for those with broad license to work from home and regardless of organization size.
Yeah, that's right. And you see email ramps up in importance as company size grows, but it's also closely shadowed by collaboration tools and conferencing tools. And I think conferencing tools in particular have the sweet spot of around the 250 to 1,000 employee mark, where they can make a real impact on things like virtual town halls and so on. But the impact that's it may have on the workforce that is too distributed and too much of a large company might be a little bit more limited. And there's another story behind these numbers as well. So remote workers in the US are generally pretty comfortable with software outside of email. And there's not really many people kind of not using this type of stuff. But they've got quite a bit of room to grow in the UK, where almost 20% of remote workers don't use video conferencing tools at all, for example. And video conferencing is definitely an important one, and it's gotten so much more attention now. I mean, both professionally and personally, because of the kind of climate of lockdown and isolation. And there's a lot to be said for investing in more advanced communication technology for your employees, like video conferencing software. And our research shows that it does have far-reaching benefits. So video conferencing tools, for example, it's one of the more involved or advanced communication technologies. And we're seeing that workers who rely more heavily on video tech, who regard it as essential to enabling their remote working, are less likely to be struggling with a lot of these work issues at home, like getting IT support and maintaining network security standards. They're also more likely to feel positive about collaboration and brainstorming with their colleagues at this time of working from home. So this really speaks to some of the benefits of investing in this type of tech, which, I mean, arguably, I think is going to be really crucial for the future of work. Which, speaking of the future of work, that transitions us nicely into the next section.
So in all the research that we've done on coronavirus, not just in B2B, but in B2C context as well, there's always that $1 million question lurking in the background about what sort of behavior is going to stick afterwards. And remote working is obviously no exception. There's a lot of variables that will decide what sort of future work environment we end up in, whether it is a case of back to normal or a more meaningful change. But to try and figure that out, we can at least get an idea of how employees themselves are feeling about it. And it's 42% that would want to reduce the amount of time they spend working from home, but over half would want to maintain it or even increase it. Now, this is a general picture, but more than ever, it's really important to dig into this data and understand the patterns behind it. And what's important to consider here is that the current situation is likely to be quite biasing. We're trying to gauge from people who've been forced to work from home for at least a month now, as we've seen, likely with not a huge amount of support or preparation, whether they want to do more of it in the future. And you can understand that they're probably answering this question with the frustrations and loneliness of lockdown on their minds. And the only way to truly gauge whether the appetite for working from home will be higher than before is when everyone has a chance to return to normal for a bit of time and then maybe reevaluate their actual preferences and what sort of lifestyle they want when they've got more freedom to actually choose it for themselves.
That's a good point, Chris. But for the kind of information we have, we can slice this data to find out exactly where people have the most interest in working from home, more often or less often, across things like demographics and work sectors. And there are some interesting stories here. So the age range most likely to want to work from home more often in the future is the 25 to 44-year-olds, which I think shows the positive impact that working from home can have with other factors at that kind of certain life stage that people are at, like childcare, for example. And I think that's a really important one. Just speaking to colleagues that I work with, I think having this kind of time to be around their kids and their families has been really rewarding, even if you're not being engaged with them all of the time. So I think that is one factor that's really influencing people wanting to kind of pursue that remote work life just to a greater extent than maybe they normally did. 45 to 64-year-olds, on the other hand, are much more likely to want to work from home less, which I think is hinting at this demographic perhaps wanting more social interaction through the workplace.
So some other groups that are more likely to want to work from home more are those in the UK, as well as those working in financial services and industrial jobs. Those that work in arts, media and tech actually want to cut down their working from home time. And to me, I think this shows how industries with less exposure to working from home want to perhaps continue enjoying its benefits and maybe enjoying the change of setting, whereas those that have maybe done it more in the past are now looking for a more in-person interaction again. I think it shows that when we talk about remote working, we've got to consider it in the context of balance versus other environments.
Yeah, certainly. And above all, it really does depend on the individual, though. And we've seen that life circumstances and personal circumstances are the kind of biggest challenges. We can find certain patterns and make certain recommendations on who benefits the most from working from home. And we'll definitely continue kind of to do this and understand the data as much as we can. But so much does depend on the individual and their home life circumstances. So let's use, for example, people working in large enterprises, i.e. those companies with over 2,000 employees. 51% of those would want to work from home less often, and 34% would want to work from home more often, and which in both cases, that puts these large enterprises above businesses of smaller sizes. The differences being that fewer want to work about the same amount than they did earlier. So it's really difficult to make a blanket case for the future of remote working in large enterprises. And I think it really testifies to the understanding that, what works for one person may not work for another person, because just our life circumstances are different, and they're what kind of ultimately decide what's comfortable and what's sustainable.
Yeah, and that story comes through whenever you cut this particular data. So quite amazingly, having training or resources doesn't seem to have an appreciable impact on whether people want to work from home more or less often in the future. I think it really does depend on their home setup as to whether they ultimately want to carry on for the foreseeable future of their working life. We obviously don't want to suggest there's no need for training whatsoever, but if you're thinking about remote working in an organization further in the future, say when the worst of this is over, you really have to have an idea of what that home life is like.
Yeah, that is really important as we've continued to see. Okay, great. So some really good insights there. Thank you, Chris, for taking that one home. So we've come to the end of our session now, and we're going to wrap it up with just a single slide with some of the key takeaways from our research. So first of all, despite this being a difficult time, obviously a very difficult time, it's not all bad for every single industry. We touched on the fact that certain industries like IT, for example, are actually seeing some kind of unique opportunities crop up as workers increasingly require different software, technologies, security networks, VPN, all of this kind of stuff. So it's important to look for these positives in the midst of all of the negativity which is surrounding us everywhere. Secondly, we know that the ability to work from home has set up companies for better productivity and efficiency even before this crisis. So if there were any misconceptions still left out there that people from working from home are less productive, less driven, are slacking, or taking advantage of not, constantly being monitored, I think that's been properly debunked now. We know that people work more and they work harder. So this leads into the next point. Having a work from home policy without proper training can sometimes be worse than having no policy at all. It's that shaky middle ground that we have to be really wary of sometimes, as we've seen with people being kind of insensitive about communication at all hours and times and kind of not respecting that work home boundary. And I think some of our colleagues in HR would really stand with us on this point in a lot of cases. Life meets home, home meets life. Again, very related. The struggles are personal, not just logistical. What we've seen is that the biggest challenges for people working from home tend to be things that they can't necessarily control in their personal lives, right? And companies have to be understanding of this and shift their mentalities a bit because it's not a business as usual time right now. And related to this, it's important to check in on your colleagues' mental health, especially the younger ones. The reality is that people are struggling with feelings of loneliness and isolation, and a lot of them want their employers to be interested and engaged and a bit more committed and to really see how they're doing. And number 6, this is where advanced tools will shine. So we touched on that with the importance of things like conferencing software, video conferencing, and collaboration tools. And these are all really having a big moment right now. And I think that we'll see adoption accelerate when we go back to normalcy. And lastly, related to normalcy, I think that a lot of this data points to the fact that we'll have to wait for normalcy to return to truly understand the impacts of this whole working from home situation on everyone in the long term, whether they're going to want to keep doing this to a greater degree. Working from home is so ubiquitous right now, but like the question is it the future? And people have a lot of feelings now, so it's hard to understand what their long-term views will be. Therefore, really only a return to normalcy is going to be able to tell us that.
Thanks for that, Werner. I think that just about wraps things up. I mean, we hope you've all found this helpful. If you'd like a more detailed download of this information, or if you'd like to follow up on anything you've seen, we encourage you to submit your questions to trends@globalwebindex.com. And of course, check out the rest of the great free content on our Coronavirus Content Hub. Additionally, we're always trying to stay on the pulse of this issue, so keep an eye on the content we have in the pipeline too, as we're updating it each week through repeated research. We release regular research in the UK and US, and in the week commencing the 27th of April, we'll release another international study covering a multitude of markets, with some questions included for trending purposes to keep pace with developments, and some exploring new areas. We're also considering further international recontact research, and we're opening this to client requests for options to be included in return for contribution to costs.
Yes, always trying to have a greater understanding of the issue. So stay tuned. And just as a last note, we'd really like to end this webinar on something positive, which we've been trying to do throughout these webinars. Obviously, we're all in a very lucky position here as we're able to be working from home and to be sharing content like this with you all. But everything we've been talking about here is linked to a massive global health crisis that's affecting people's health, their ability to provide for their families. It's going to lead to the shutdown of a lot of small businesses, unfortunately. So we've linked to a few charities here that are really helping to make a difference. And this time around, we've kind of shaken it up a little bit, and we're focusing on some charities that have some sort of work angle. So the Work From Home or HOPE initiative being done by The Guardian is a whole kind of arts initiative. You can go and buy a print that kind of captures this whole spirit of working from home, with the profits going to help the NHS and healthcare workers on the front line. If you're local to the US, you can check this directory by USA Today that shows you how exactly you can support some of the local businesses in your community that are really struggling right now. And the last one, the Direct Relief Fund. So this is a great organization working to provide personal protective equipment directly to people on the front lines of the kind of healthcare fight against the coronavirus. So these obviously don't cover anywhere near all of the great organizations helping with this cause, but they're just a couple that we wanted to spotlight. And we would, of course, love it if getting some of this insight actually inspired anyone to get involved a little bit in whatever way you can. So thank you so much for joining, everyone. Just a reminder, please send any questions you have to trends@globalwebindex.com, and we will try to get back to you as soon as possible with some more information and clarity. And that is all from us. Enjoy your weekend, folks.